Welcome to the Divorce Your Remarriage podcast. We're here. We're going over my book here, Divorce Your Remarriage. We're continuing our series, and now we're going to jump into 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So suppose a friend comes up to you and he says, I've been learning about the Civil War, and I learned that between 500,000 and 1 million people died in the Civil War. Isn't that crazy? It's a lot of people. And that actually most of the people who died were of African descent. Now, if you hear that from somebody, you might scratch your head and be like, I don't actually think the second part is true. Like, I'm pretty sure that's not the case. And then if you say that to the person, you might go, I should clarify. I'm talking about the Mozambique Civil War, right? So that's like a very relevant fact because you might have thought automatically he's talking about the U.S. Civil War, but he's talking about the Mozambique Civil War. So now his comments make a whole lot more sense. This concept of like getting some context and understanding what a person is talking about is a problem people run into with 1 Corinthians chapter 7, because they don't understand how Paul divided up the chapters. They don't know who he's talking to, his audience, and they kind of mix up categories and they get all confused. So we're going to talk about that today when we go through 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Okay, so we're going to break down 1 Corinthians chapter 7 as 40 verses. We're going to break it down into some bite-sized pieces to help us. Verses 1 through 7, Paul is saying that celibacy is preferred, but it's not required for the Christian life. And then verses 8 and 9, he's speaking to widows and widowers. In verses 10 through 24, he's speaking to the married. And then 25 through the end of the chapter, except for the last verse, he's talking to the betrothed. So he's going in reverse chronological order. The widows and widowers, then the married, then the betrothed. Betrothed is like a fiance, but maybe a little bit more serious back in the day. But it's basically like they're engaged to be married. For those of you watching on video, you have it on your screen. I'm going to go ahead and read it. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. That's in the ESV translation. So here's what's going on. The Corinthians wrote Paul a letter. We don't have that letter. It's lost to history as far as we know, where they asserted, or at least hypothesized, but they probably asserted that in Christianity, celibacy is required. People must be abstinent, and they said that. And now, why did they say that? Well, we don't know, but they're in Corinth, and it's very lascivious there, and they might be just reacting. They have a good instinct. They want to reject the culture, and that's good, but they might be going too far with it. And so they're going, you know what? Let's just end all this sex stuff. We're just going to go total celibacy, and that's that. We've had it with all of this terrible stuff in our culture, and they're kind of being reactionary and going too far. And Paul's like, well, hold on, hit the brakes here. You might be going too far. You might actually be causing a different problem by going too far. So Paul says that this policy of celibacy is going to cause sexual sin. Not everybody can do this. So if you put this policy on everybody, they're going to hold back, and then eventually they're going to go sin. And what Paul says is, it's not that sex needs to be avoided, it's that sin needs to be avoided. And now, of course, there's overlap there sometimes. There's such a thing as called as sexual sin, obviously, but not all sexual activity is sin, for example, in marriage. So what he's saying is avoid sin is the rule, not avoid sex. He tries to move them from a policy of we have to be celibate to a policy of celibacy is preferred. So celibacy is not required, but it is better. It's preferred. So that's really important, because a lot of times people will go to 1 Corinthians 7 looking to see, is there a way to be able to remarry? And nobody's thinking about that at the time, but we might be thinking about that when we go to the passage. But that's not what they were thinking about. So that can cause us to read things out of context. All right, so now we're going to read verses 8 and 9. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than burn with passion. Okay, so here Paul is speaking to the unmarried and the widows, and automatically people get confused. Who are the unmarried? Who is this unmarried group? So the unmarried here are widowers. It's widowers and widows. You'll notice nowhere in the passage does it say the word widowers anywhere through the chapter. And so you might think, where are the widowers mentioned? Well, they're right here in 1 Corinthians 7:8. So the reason you know it's widowers is the structure of the whole passage. So in the first part, he's talking to widows and widowers, and then later the married, and then later the betrothed. He's not lumping in two different groups of people that are like unrelated, the unmarried and the widows. That wouldn't make really any sense. That's not the structure of the passage. The structure of the passage goes in kind of reverse chronological order: widows, married, betrothed. It's very easy to see that. And this word unmarried can mean lots of different things. And so what some people do is they'll look later on, they'll see the word unmarried refers to divorced people, and they'll go, oh, Paul must be talking about divorced people here in 1 Corinthians 7:8. And so if you're divorced and you have passion, you can go ahead and get remarried. That's like the logic they use. But that's totally incorrect. He's talking here about widows and widowers. Repeatedly in various places, Paul talks about how it's permissible to remarry if your spouse has died. And that's just clearly what he's talking about here. If he was talking about divorced people in verse 8, then he'd be contradicting himself in like 5 seconds. And you'll see in the next passage where he tells people who are unmarried not to remarry. So he's not contradicting himself. Paul's a very smart guy. He's not contradicting himself within 3 verses of himself. He writes, to the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. Okay, so the first thing to notice here is to whom Paul is writing. He's writing to the married. This is for the married people. He has this interesting phrase where he says, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. What he's saying is basically, this is a way of saying, I am paraphrasing what Jesus said. I am saying what Jesus said in different words. Or here is the policy based upon the teachings of Jesus. That's what he's talking about. This is derived from what Jesus had said. That's his whole point here. And it's very simple. Don't divorce. If you do divorce, you can go back to your previous valid spouse. You could do that. But you know what you can't do? Can't go marry somebody else. That's what you can't do. So that's what he says here, 1 Corinthians 7, 10 and 11. And now I should mention, this is just the first 2 verses of the to the married section. This section, to the married, goes from verse 10, we just read 10 and 11, all the way down through verse 24. And right here, I just want to mention something. A lot of conservative evangelicals, when explaining the portion to the married, they stop at verse 16 and they don't keep going. And that's because they think verses 17 through 24, Paul just like changed the subject. He went off on like a path somewhere that has no relation to anything else he's writing, and then he comes back to it after verse 24. But that's not the case. And verses 17 to 24 all relate to the married. So 12 through 16. Here we go. This is the controversial part. A lot of people who are permissive or lenient, they beeline for 1 Corinthians 7, and they go down here to this portion of the chapter. All right. Paul writes, to the rest, I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. But, this is verse 15. This is the big verse. This is the big verse. Verse 15. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved, for God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Okay. The first part to wrestle with is this phrase, to the rest. Now, earlier we had to the unmarried and the widows, and then we had to the married, and now we see to the rest. And so you might think, a new demographic group, but not exactly. Widows and widowers, that's a very specific group. You could identify who they are by their marital status, which is their spouse had died. To the married, again, you can identify who they are, very specific group, very specific demographic, they're married. Very obvious, right? What is to the rest? Rest is not a people group. That's not a demographic. All right. So to the rest, what he's saying here, to the rest, I say, I, not the Lord. So that what he's saying there is, okay, hey guys, I just paraphrased what Jesus said. I just gave you a derivative statement based on what Jesus had taught. Remember earlier? Let's go back to that previous section there where he says to the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. So here's paraphrasing what Jesus says. And then starting in verse 12, he says, to the rest, I say, I, not the Lord. So what he's doing is he's putting a bookend on that. He's saying, okay, I'm done paraphrasing what Jesus said, and now we're going to talk about things that Jesus didn't like specifically get into, questions he didn't particularly answer, they didn't come up or whatever. So this is to the rest, is like the rest of the things I'm saying are things that Jesus didn't specifically speak to. This was really important because here's the move people make in conservative evangelicalism. They will say that to the rest refers to believers married to unbelievers. So that's step one. They say to the rest means believers married to unbelievers. And then from that, they infer that the previous verses were believers married to believers. And since the verses before were a paraphrase of what Jesus was saying, that Jesus must have only been speaking about marriages between believers. And so therefore, the things Jesus said in Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Mark 10, Luke 16, those are only for believer marriages, right? And what Paul's writing here is about unbeliever marriages. Now, and the next step they're going to do, just so you understand, is they'll say, well, if your spouse is acting like an unbeliever, if they're acting very sinfully, then they're an unbeliever, and then you can divorce them. So that's the move they make, right? They try to narrow what Jesus said to believer marriages, so that they can say, if somebody acts like an unbeliever, then you can divorce them, and you can basically ignore what Jesus had said about that based on the conduct of a spouse that's not acting very well. You're having marital problems. Of course, people get divorced when there's marital problems. So basically, 1 Corinthians 7:15 ends up being like a rule replacement, or 12 through 16 ends up being a rule replacement, so you can divorce and remarry whenever you want. It's a kind of a complicated way to make a bunch of loopholes so that you can just kind of ignore what Jesus said there in the Gospels. Okay. And they get all of that. They get all of that from the phrase to the rest. I have to tell you, that's a lot. That's a lot to get out of the phrase to the rest. Okay, it's a little bit too much. At the Supreme Court, I mentioned this in my book, at the Supreme Court, they have a phrase that Congress does not hide elephants in mouse holes. Okay, and what that would mean in this context is, if Paul was trying to say that, he'd have to say something a little bit more than to the rest. Okay, so what he's saying here to the rest is just very simple. The rest of what I'm writing is not a paraphrase of what Jesus had specifically said. That's all it means. It doesn't mean all this complicated stuff, narrowing Jesus' words to believers. I mean, it feels like whenever I hear this, I feel like I'm in some like camp meeting with dispensationalists with huge charts and complicated whiteboards and markers everywhere. And I'm like, what are you talking about? It just says to the rest. We don't need to overread it. Okay, it's not that complicated. All right, to the rest, I say, I, not the Lord. Okay. And then he says, so if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever. Okay, so here what he's talking about is, if you're married to an unbeliever, if you're a believer married to an unbeliever, don't divorce them. Now you have to remember, the Corinthians, they're like looking for abstinence. They think, oh, we have to be celibate. And they go, oh, well, I'm married to an unbeliever. Maybe I should divorce them. Okay, because their tendency now is to want to be celibate because they're probably reacting to the lascivious culture around them, understandably, but they shouldn't be divorcing their unbelieving spouse because they don't like their culture. Okay, so he says, if they'll stay with you, stay with them. Don't be getting divorced from people. Okay, now that's one reason why maybe they want to divorce, is because they want to go like the celibacy route. Another possibility, though, is that they have read Ezra, and in Ezra chapter 9. As the nation of Israel was being reconstituted, Ezra noticed, this is terrible. Our people are married to idolaters. This is no good. This is technically, it was an offense worthy of stoning in the Old Testament. So to do idolatry. So, and if you marry somebody who's an idolater, the ceremony and all that is probably idolatrous. So anyway, the point is, Ezra required a divorce in Ezra chapter 9, and Nehemiah may have later, but it's not exactly clear in that book. But anyway, the point is, they required divorce. And so the people in Corinth might be like, oh, hey, we're Jewish. We know they're Jewish because later on Paul writes about betrothals. So of course they must know about betrothals, hence they're Jewish. But anyway, so hey, we're Jewish. We know about Ezra. You could divorce unbelievers then. We should be able to divorce unbelievers now. Ezra was a good guy, so we should be able to do that now. Well, there's a problem with that. Because Paul here says, don't divorce an unbelieving spouse. And so people have wondered, how do you distinguish Ezra from Paul? Because their policies appear to be different. And really, Perhaps a main reason for them being different is that Ezra was acting, he had the executory function of the government. And so those marriages he may have not viewed as being legitimate from a governmental perspective. And so he's using his power as a government authority to impose a divorce. Whereas here, these divorces, if people want to get divorced, a believer from an unbeliever, would be a spouse initiating a divorce. So that's one possible difference. Also, they probably would be construed as committing idolatry when they got married to the person, so they could be penalized by being stoned to death, and require them to divorce or leave would be a lesser penalty. That's another justification for this. It does look like from the language Ezra uses that perhaps he didn't believe these marriages were legitimate because they didn't follow the civil law, because you couldn't marry an idolater. So there's a number of reasons why it would be different in Ezra's time than it was in Paul, and I think a lot of it has to do with that Ezra was a government official and Paul is not. Paul's an apostle. Okay, so and that's a whole complicated discussion, but anyway, you get the idea. Another concern they might have is that sex with their unbelieving spouse, maybe they thought it was sacrilegious. I mean, if they're the temple of the Holy Spirit, and they've got this unbelieving spouse who's a daughter of a strange God, as Malachi refers to it. I mean, maybe this is, some kind of idolatrous, sacrilegious kind of thing. So a genuine, understandable concern that they may have had. But Paul says, don't worry about any of that. And then he writes about how the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife and vice versa, else your children would be unclean. And what that means exactly is a little difficult to discern. It does not mean that they were saved by virtue of being married to a believer, because we see in verse 16, how do you know if you're going to save your spouse? He talks about that in verse 16. So they're not saved, but they're set apart in a special way. That's what the word holy means. We don't know if there's anything spiritual going on. I can't say that there is or there isn't, but certainly they're under the influence of the gospel as long as they're married to a believing spouse, and that is worth a lot. But verse 15 is where it gets really interesting. If the unbelieving spouse wants to leave, let it be so. Now that is the only verb here. Let it be so. That's the action that the believer should do. So what does that mean? Well, the believer, you can try to use persuasion to try to prevent your spouse from leaving you, obviously, but don't use pressure. Don't make the division of assets difficult. Don't refuse to sign the divorce paperwork. Don't make it like over the top difficult. Like if they want to go, if they're dead set on leaving, let it be so. And then he says that in such a case, a believer is not enslaved, and God has called us to peace. So I'm going to get into this phrase, not enslaved. This is a really big deal. This is the phrase, not enslaved, that is used to justify lots of divorces and lots of remarriages in conservative evangelicalism. And I think it's a completely wrong interpretation. But before I get into that, let me mention that Paul talks about here about people separating. He's not using the word that we would think of as for divorce. So what does that mean? How should we understand that? Is he talking about separation, or is he talking about divorce? So in our day today, we distinguish between separation and divorce. Somebody could live in New York, a husband, and the wife could live in Los Angeles, and they're separate but still married. Legally still married, we would still consider them married. But back in Corinth, they lived under Roman law, and the Roman law, they kept changing the laws on divorce and remarriage all the time. They were worried about population levels. It's very complicated. But anyway, during a portion of that time, they had the law said if a spouse moves out, they're like auto divorced. Okay, so they weren't. I think of the Romans as being all into paperwork. When it came to divorce, apparently they weren't all that much into paperwork. They were like, light years behind the Jewish people who had the divorce certificate from Moses back in Deuteronomy 24. Here we're fast forward all these years, they haven't figured out the divorce certificate here in Roman times. But anyway, so in Corinth, somebody separated, they were like auto divorce. So there was no need to make some kind of distinction between separation and divorce. The unbelieving partner separates, they divorce, basically they move out, they take their stuff with them or whatever. And then Paul tells the believer, well, let it be so. And in such a case, the believer is not enslaved. God's called us to peace. What does not enslaved mean? So now some translations translate this, I think, just incorrectly to not bound. And if you look at the Greek word, and people have noticed this, scholars have noticed this, the Greek word for it is definitely about slavery. It's a different word. And the word for bound, used everywhere else when it talks about bound in a marriage, is a totally different Greek word, which is why the ESV correctly slates it, not enslaved. Okay, so why is Paul using this phrase, not enslaved? What does this mean? He's definitely using a different word. Later on in the same chapter, he uses the normal word for bound. What's the difference between not enslaved and not bound? If there is a difference, what is the difference? The difference is this. Slavery is a unilateral bond. right? The slave is bound to the master, but the master is not bound to the slave, not the other way around. But marriage is a bilateral bond. Husband and wife are bound to each other. It's a bilateral bond. So that's the main difference there. Now, think about this. If Paul was saying not enslaved and he meant not married, what he was saying was one spouse was a slave to the other. That doesn't make any sense. Husbands, did Paul really teach that husbands are slaves to their wives? Does anybody think that's reasonable given all the things that Paul wrote? It seems very unlikely to me. More likely what he's talking about here is the difficulty, the encumbrance placed upon a believer by being married to an unbeliever. A believer wants to live for God. A believer wants to serve God. And if they're married to an unbeliever, it slows it down. It makes it difficult. And here throughout the whole chapter, Paul talks about the challenges posed by just a regular marriage between two believers. Well, a believer and an unbeliever, I mean, there's a lot more challenges, generally speaking, most of the time. So when Paul says not enslaved, what he means is not encumbered. Now, the phrase not enslaved, when it's interpreted to mean that a believer can remarry after an unbeliever leaves them, abandons them, that's typically called the Pauline privilege. So you may have heard that phrase before, the Pauline privilege. That's where they get this from. Unbeliever abandons the believer, and then the believer is free to remarry. That's the view. I disagree with that. I don't think not enslaved means not married. I think it means not encumbered from being able to serve God. They're still married to their spouse from God's perspective after the unbeliever leaves. They're still married the rest of their life because the spouse hasn't died yet. But now they're not encumbered in the same way that they were before when they were living out their married life together before the unbeliever abandoned. Okay. And then it says, for God has called you to peace, which is like this general phrase about living out God's calling. This is kind of an aside, but it seems to me that remarrying after divorce is not exactly what you would call pursuing peace. That's pursuing like jealousy. You're going to make the other spouse jealous. Does Paul somewhere define what he means by not enslaved? And the answer is yes, he does. In the next passage of verses, which conservative evangelicals typically just kind of pass over because they think it's a digression. They don't think Paul is explaining himself, but he is in fact explaining himself. All right, so here we have 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 24. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Check out this verse starting in verse 21. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who is free when called as a bondservant of Christ, you were bought with a price. Do not become the bondservants of men. Brothers, in whatsoever condition each was called, let him there remain with God. Okay, so now you'll notice he does the circumcision, uncircumcision thing, which I think relates to being married to an unbeliever. Like, don't leave them. Don't try to change it. Leave it alone. Stay with the unbelieving spouse. So that's that analogy. And then the second analogy is to the bondservant. Now you have to notice, Paul says in verse 15, not enslaved. The only other time he references slavery is starting in verse 21. So that's his analogy to slavery. He's using the same concept right there. It's in the same chapter. This is the only other place in the chapter where he talks about slavery. So you would think, oh, light bulb, it must be related. So here what he's saying is that if the bondservant can get free and be not enslaved, he should do so. Why? Because now he can serve God better. And that's the whole point up in verse 15. If the unbeliever leaves, now the believer is free to be able to serve God, and they're not encumbered from being able to serve God like the way they were before the unbeliever left them. Now we're going to get into the betrothed. This is a bunch of verses here. But now you have to just remember, this is all about the betrothed. This is not about the married. This is not about widows. This is about the betrothed. And that's really important because people will read this passage and they'll get confused. They'll forget, oh, we're talking about the betrothed, and they'll think they're talking about the married. When they talk about people who are betrothed, they refer to the man who was betrothed and they didn't call the man betrothed, typically, as I can tell from the New Testament. But the man who was engaged, we'll just say, or betrothed, he was called the husband. And the woman who was betrothed is called the wife. And so you're going to see husband and wife talking here, but he's talking about betrothed people. So when you hear husband and wife, you have to figure out, okay, you're talking about betrothed husband and wife, which is not really married, or are they talking about married husband and wife. And the way you know that is verse 25. He starts with, now concerning the betrothed. And he says, I have no commandment from the Lord. Again, he's very clear. He wants to make sure he's very precise. He wants to make very sure that everybody knows what he's paraphrasing from Jesus and what he's not paraphrasing from Jesus. And so this is verse 25, just like we saw earlier where he says, I say I, not the Lord. When he said to the rest, he was just, again, making sure everyone's really clear what he's paraphrasing from Jesus and what he's not paraphrasing from Jesus. So here he says, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you of that. All right, let me just pause right here. Here's the phrase people get tripped up on. They say, are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife, but if you marry, you have not sinned. Oh, so if I'm free from a wife, so people think, oh, okay, well, if I'm divorced, now I'm free from a wife, and now if I marry, I have not sinned. And why would I marry? Because I have hormones. I'm a red-blooded American or a red-blooded human or whatever, and I want to go marry somebody, right? And I have not sinned. And they take this verse and they take it to mean that. Of course, that's not what he's talking about, because he's talking to who? He's talking to the betrothed. He's not talking to people who are divorced here. And how do you know that? Because he writes, but if you marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Why? Oh, why is he talking about betrothed? Because the man he's talking about who's free from a wife is somebody who is free from a betrothal. So the idea here is a man and a woman were betrothed to be married to each other, and they broke it off. They didn't end up getting married, so now he's free from a wife, and so now he can go marry somebody else. That's the whole idea there. And so he's talking to the betrothed here, not to divorce people. Again, if he meant you can divorce and you can remarry and you have not sinned, if that's what he meant, well, he contradicted himself earlier. Then he says, that is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning. And he goes on like that. And what he's talking about here is you want to have a eternal perspective, not a temporal perspective. All right, so now we're going to do verses 32 through 38. We're almost done with the chapter here. I want you to be free from anxieties. Let me just pause. What he's saying, that celibacy is preferable but not required. He keeps going back to that same thing because that's the flaw in the Corinthian thinking that he's trying to correct from the very first verse. You have to keep that in mind as you're reading the whole thing. And so he says, and this is an argument for celibacy is preferred, but I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord, but the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and in spirit, but the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this to your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. So here he's saying, I'm not trying to put any restraint on you. And that's a way of saying your policy of celibacy is required is putting restraint on people. It's putting an unbearable burden on people who don't have a gift of celibacy. But order means marry if you need to. If you don't need to marry, it's good to be single. Okay. All right, so we pick up in verse 36. If anyone thinks he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes, let them marry, it is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then, he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. And so again, he's going back to this idea of celibacy is preferred but not required. All right, and now we're on the last two verses. So a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. This is the rule. Now, if you have a lenient or permissive take on divorce and remarriage, and this is a phrase you're not going to want to say. It's just not going to even occur to you that a person is bound to their spouse as long as they live, because you don't think that. You think they're bound until they divorce for this reason, or they divorce for that reason, or they remarry or whatever. And so this is too simple of a statement. But Paul is simple and absolute. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. And obviously, it's vice versa also. The whole chapter, Paul makes sure that all the rules for men apply to women and vice versa. He spends a lot of ink to make sure everybody knows that. Also, this phrase, phrase that she's bound to her husband as long as he lives, as I mentioned in prior episodes, is also in the Damascus Document, believed by the Essenes, as far as we can tell, where he talks about a guy marries a second wife while the first is alive. Paul also writes this in Romans chapter 7, verse 2, for a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. So it's a very simple rule. Two people, once they're married, they cannot be unmarried. They are bound to one another for the rest of their life. Just because they got a civil divorce, they got a document from the government that says that they're divorced, that does not mean God views them as divorced. They're still actually married. So if they marry somebody else while their first valid spouse is alive, that remarriage is a continual state, a perpetual state of adultery against the first spouse. And that's why they should divorce their remarriage, which is the name of my book, Divorce Your Remarriage. You can get it at Amazon.com. I have a link to it in the description below. Thank you for going through the chapter with me, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now, next time, we're going to go through very complicated divorce and remarriage scenarios to try to figure out what is it that we do in this or that different scenario. So I'll see you next time.